When the mountain winds howled through the snow-covered plains, they scoffed at the strange cabin he'd built, a fortress made of stone, cold and unwelcoming, much like the man who crafted it. But soon they would discover the secret that turned his prison-like shelter into a life-saving refuge, keeping the cold out and the warmth in when every other structure failed. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you're captivated by the fierce survival tales of the frontier, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's episode brings an even more incredible story from the wilds of the unknown. The snow settled heavily on the ground, thick and unforgiving, as Elias Wheeler stood outside the cabin, his breath fogging in the crisp air. The stone walls loomed like silent sentinels, their thick exterior marking the start of something that no one believed would work. But Elias knew better. The world around him seemed as cold as the structure he had crafted with his own hands, a shelter made not of logs like most, but of stone, something his peers laughed at. The winter of 1853 had come early, and already the harsh winds of the Rocky Mountains had begun to cut through anything that stood in their path. Elias had built his stone cabin on a rise above the surrounding terrain, hoping to escape the fierce snowdrifts that often swamped lower ground. It was isolated. The closest neighbor was miles away. The solitude was something he had grown accustomed to, but his cabin, no matter how solid, was a challenge to the men who passed by in disbelief. "You've got yourself a prison, Elias," one old trapper had scoffed when he first saw the stone walls, his breath puffing in the frigid air. "Ain't no comfort in a place like that. It's just a tomb." But Elias wasn't looking for comfort. He wasn't looking for approval either. What he sought was survival. After too many nights spent in drafty log cabins, where he had shivered through the long nights, battling the cold and sleeplessness, Elias had made a decision. He would build a cabin that was not only a home, but a fortress, a sanctuary from the harshness of nature. He had learned many things in his years on the frontier, and one of the most important lessons was this: winter could kill you. It wasn't just the snow or the ice, it was the cold that seeped into your bones that made you feel hollow, like a fragile shell. The men who had come before him, the ones who had fallen to the cold, had made the mistake of building too quickly, too carelessly, using whatever wood was at hand, ignoring the long-term toll the seasons would take. Elias wasn't going to make that mistake. He had taken his time, too much time, some said. But now, standing outside his completed cabin, he could feel the weight of every stone, every laborious hour spent shaping the rocks, setting them into place. It had taken him nearly 6 months to finish. The structure, longer than any cabin he had built before. But it wasn't just the time he spent, it was the care. Elias had scoured the surrounding hills for the right stones, ones that would fit tightly together, with no gaps for the wind to creep through. Each stone had been shaped by hand, a meticulous process that left his hands raw and calloused. The roof had been constructed with care, layered with materials he had gathered from the surrounding forest. And inside he had placed a hearth, a real stone fireplace, designed to keep the entire cabin warm, even when the coldest winds howled outside. The work had been hard, but it was nothing compared to the reward of stepping into his cabin now. When the wind howled through the mountains, Elias could stand inside, secure in the knowledge that the stone walls would hold firm. The cabin was small, cramped even, but it was safe. Safe from the cold, safe from the predators that lurked in the wilds, and safe from the world's judgment. It was just him and the mountains now. No more mocking whispers, no more doubt. He was ready for whatever the winter had to offer. The first test came sooner than Elias had anticipated. It was only a week after the cabin's completion when the snowstorm rolled in. It came fast, dark clouds gathering on the horizon, promising the type of storm that could leave a man stranded for days if he wasn't careful. Elias had already secured his food, his traps checked and rechecked. He had stocked enough firewood to last him the winter, though he knew that the mountain's hunger for supplies would eventually outweigh what he had gathered. By the time the storm reached its peak, the wind was howling through the trees, bending them as if they were mere twigs in the air. Elias stood at the cabin door, peering through the narrow slit he had left for a window. Outside, the snow fell in thick sheets, blanketing everything, erasing the world outside the cabin walls. It was impossible to see more than a few feet in front of him. He stepped back into the cabin and stoked the fire, the warmth from the hearth filling the small space. He had designed the fireplace to draw heat from every log he placed, the stone absorbing and radiating warmth throughout the cabin. Already the temperature inside had risen, a sharp contrast to the freezing air just beyond the door. Elias smiled, a rare thing for him, but this was proof. The storm raged on for hours. The winds shook the stone walls, but not a single draft crept in. The fire crackled, steady and true, its heat enough to keep the entire cabin warm, despite the raging cold outside. For the first time in years, Elias felt completely secure. He had done it. His cabin, built of stone, had held up against the fury of nature. But as the hours dragged on and the wind screamed outside, Elias knew this was only the beginning. He had survived one night, but many more would follow. The real test wouldn't be whether his cabin could withstand a single storm, but whether it could stand up to the mountain itself, day after day, year after year. It wasn't just the cold that he had to worry about. It was the isolation, the silence that could drive a man mad if he didn't stay sharp. But Elias wasn't afraid of the silence. He was used to it. He welcomed it, for it was in those moments alone that he could reflect, think, and plan. Out here, in the wilderness, there was no room for distractions. There was only survival, and in that survival, he found a peace that no man in the busy cities could ever understand. For now, though, Elias settled in front of the fire, the storm still howling outside, and let the warmth of the stone walls surround him. There would be no doubters here. Only time would tell whether the cabin would stand up to the mountain, but Elias was ready for whatever came next. The storm raged for days, an unyielding force that kept Elias inside, trapped in his small stone refuge. Each night, the howling winds seemed louder, more insistent, pushing against the stone walls as if testing them for weakness. But the cabin stood firm, its walls unshaken by the storm's fury. Elias could hear the wind's voice, howling in the trees, rattling against the stones, but it never broke through. During the long hours of silence, Elias found himself lost in thought. The isolation was heavy, pressing down on him like the weight of the snow outside. It was easy to forget what day it was, or even what year. Time had a way of becoming meaningless out here, in the wild expanse of the mountains. He had lived alone before, but never like this, with no one to talk to, no one to share the endless hours with. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the occasional groan of the cabin as the wind pushed against it. His mind often wandered to the life he had left behind. He had been a trapper once, working with other men, surviving on the fringes of society. But that life had worn thin. The cold had driven him away from everything, from the people, from the noise of the world. He had come to the mountains to escape it all, to find something more, something he hadn't been able to find in the crowded towns and the bustling camps. Here, in this solitude, he could think clearly. Here, he could breathe without the weight of expectations. But the loneliness began to creep in after the days passed. Elias had expected the silence to be peaceful, but there were times when it felt suffocating. He missed the sound of human voices, the laughter, and the conversation. He had chosen this life, but now, more than ever, he wondered if it had been the right choice. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth filling the small cabin. The heat from the flames was enough to stave off the cold that would otherwise seep into his bones. He had built the stone fireplace himself, and now it was keeping him alive. The small details of his cabin, the careful construction, were what gave him comfort. Each stone, each log, Each careful choice had been made with survival in mind, and in that, Elias found a small measure of peace. The storm continued for what felt like an eternity. Each gust of wind, each wave of snow, seemed to test the resolve of both Elias and his cabin. The storm had come to show Elias what he was truly capable of enduring. It was nature's way of asking the question, how far would he go to survive? When the storm finally began to die down, the silence that followed was almost as unsettling as the roar of the wind. The snow lay deep around the cabin, blanketing everything in a quiet, frozen world. Elias stood in the doorway, looking out at the white expanse, his face tired but resolute. He had made it through the storm, and with his stone cabin still standing strong, he knew that he could make it through whatever else the mountains had in store. The storm had passed, but the cold lingered, a constant reminder that Elias was not yet free of the mountain's grasp. The world outside his cabin was a frozen wasteland, a landscape that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. There were no roads, no signs of civilization, just the raw, untamed wilderness that had always been there before him. And it was a place that had no mercy. Elias knew that survival out here wasn't just about keeping warm or building a sturdy shelter. It was about resilience, the ability to adapt, to push through hardship, and to remain focused on the goal, no matter how impossible it might seem. The days following the storm were some of the coldest Elias had ever known. The wind had subsided, but the temperature had dropped, turning the snow into a sheet of ice. The trees around the cabin were weighed down, their branches heavy with snow. Elias was no stranger to harsh winters, but this one was different. It was as though the mountain itself had chosen to test him. He spent his days checking his traps and gathering firewood, tasks that were simple but necessary. The work was hard, but Elias found solace in the rhythm of it. There was a certain peace in the repetition, a sense of order. In a world that seemed otherwise chaotic, he knew that each day was another step toward surviving the winter, and every task completed was another small victory. One afternoon, as he was gathering wood near the edge of the forest, Elias heard a strange sound. It was faint, barely audible over the wind, but it was unmistakable. The sound of something large moving through the snow. Elias froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew what it was, a bear. The grizzly had been roaming the mountains for weeks, drawn by the scent of food and the promise of an easy meal. Elias had heard rumors from other trappers about the bear's attacks, how it had destroyed cabins and killed men who had underestimated it. He had always feared the bear, but now, standing in the snow, his heart racing, he realized just how close it was. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his rifle from where it rested against a nearby tree and made his way cautiously back toward the cabin. Every step was measured, every sound amplified in the quiet, frozen world. His mind raced, weighing his options. He knew that he couldn't let the bear get too close. If it sensed him, if it felt threatened, it would attack. As Elias neared the cabin, he glanced over his shoulder. The bear was getting closer, its large form emerging from the shadows of the trees. It was slow at first, but then it picked up speed, its powerful legs pushing through the snow with ease. Elias hurried inside the cabin, slamming the door behind him. He could hear the bear outside, sniffing around the perimeter of the cabin. It was testing the stone walls, searching for a weak point. Elias stood still, his breath shallow, his fingers tight around his rifle. He had built this cabin with the express purpose of keeping animals like this out. But now, as the bear prowled outside, Elias couldn't help but wonder if it would be enough. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. The bear circled the cabin, its claws scraping against the stone as it searched for any opening, any way in. Elias's heart raced, but he remained calm. He knew that he couldn't let fear dictate his actions. He would survive this. He had built this cabin to withstand everything the wilderness could throw at him, and now he would see if it could withstand the bear. The minutes passed, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the bear moved away. Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The bear had given up, leaving him and his cabin untouched. Elias stood there in the silence, the warmth of the fire crackling softly behind him. He had passed the test, for now. But he knew that the wilderness would keep testing him, and he had to be ready for whatever came next. The cold, the storms, the bears, they were all part of the mountain's challenge. And as long as he stayed strong, as long as his cabin stood firm, he knew that he could face anything. The days grew longer as the winter settled deeper into the mountains, but the cold showed no sign of relenting. Elias found solace in the monotony of survival. Each day he woke before dawn to tend to his fire and make his rounds, checking his traps, gathering wood, and ensuring the cabin's defenses were still intact. The routine, though grueling, brought him a sense of stability. Out here, where time seemed to stretch and bend, he knew the importance of structure. Without it, the mind would wander, and that was a dangerous thing in such isolation. But then, on the 30th day of the storm, a faint sign of life appeared in the snow. As Elias trudged back from the woods after checking his traps, he noticed something unusual. At first he thought it was the wind, playing tricks on him, shifting snow in strange patterns. But as he drew closer, he saw tracks, small animal tracks, leading toward the edge of the big forest. His heart quickened. A sight like this was rare in the dead of winter, where most creatures had long retreated into hibernation or sought shelter in warmer areas. He knelt down to examine the prints more closely. The tracks were too small to belong to a bear, and the shape suggested something lighter on its feet. It was a fox, most likely, perhaps searching for food or shelter. Elias could tell by the slight drag of its tail that it had recently passed through. The thin trail of footprints cut through the heavy blanket of snow like a signature. The tracks led to the base of a nearby tree, where they disappeared into a small hole in the snow. Elias crouched down to inspect the area. Beneath the surface, he found a den, the entrance small, but deep enough to provide shelter for the fox. It had made a safe place for itself here, a cozy retreat amid the harshness of the mountain. Elias felt a flicker of relief at the sight. Life was out there, enduring just as he was. He was not alone. He stood up, brushing the snow from his gloves, and felt the cold sting against his face. For a moment, he allowed himself to savor the feeling of connection. The mountain was a harsh, indifferent place, but it was also a home to creatures that could adapt, just as he had. Elias had survived the worst of the storm, but the presence of the fox reminded him that survival was a shared struggle. In a way, it was a reminder that the wilderness, though unforgiving, could still be beautiful in its own stark way. Later that night, as Elias sat by the fire, the thought of the fox stayed with him. He had been alone for so long that it was easy to forget that life still pulsed beneath the surface of the frozen land. It was a reminder that survival was not just about isolation. It was about being connected, in some way, to the world around him. The days after the fox's visit were quieter. The winds had died down, leaving only the endless snow, and the sun seemed to set earlier with each passing evening. Elias continued his routine, but his mind wandered more often. The silence around him, which had once been a comfort, now felt heavy, an oppressive weight that pressed on his chest. The stillness of the mountains was profound, and yet it was that very stillness that made him uneasy. His thoughts were a tangled mess of doubt and longing. Elias had spent years seeking solitude, away from the noise of people and the clutter of society. But now, deep in the heart of the wilderness, he found that the silence was starting to feel less like peace and more like a prison. The absence of voices, of conversation, was beginning to gnaw at him. He had no one to talk to, no one to share the burden of his thoughts with. The isolation that had once been a refuge now seemed like a distant memory of something simpler. Even the fire, which once crackled with warmth, now felt like a barrier between him and the world outside. It was as though the cabin had become a coffin, not one of death, but of loneliness. The walls, once a source of safety, now felt confining. Elias found himself questioning everything: his decision to leave the world behind, his choice to come here, to this place of harsh winters and endless nights. One evening, as the shadows grew long and the fire began to dim, Elias stood up and walked to the door of the cabin. The cold air hit him immediately, biting at his skin, but it felt good. It felt alive. He needed to feel something, anything, beyond the stillness inside the cabin. The mountains stretched out before him, their peaks rising like silent sentinels against the darkening sky. Elias stared at them, lost in thought. He had always thought that being alone would give him the answers he was looking for, that it would clear his mind, give him the peace he longed for. But now, the silence seemed to echo back at him, magnifying the doubts he had buried deep inside. The wilderness had no answers. It was indifferent, cold, and unyielding. The mountain, for all its beauty, was a place of harsh truth, a place where survival was not guaranteed, and where hope could easily be lost. As he stood there, staring at the endless stretch of snow, Elias felt the weight of the silence more than ever before. It was as though the land itself was pressing in on him, suffocating him with its emptiness. For the first time in months, he wished for the company of another human being, for the sound of a voice, for something to break the quiet. But there was no one. There was only the snow, the wind, and the mountains, only him. And in that moment, Elias realized that he wasn't just surviving the wilderness was surviving him, testing him and teaching him something he hadn't yet learned, that isolation could be just as deadly as any bear, any storm, any cold. With a sigh, Elias turned back toward the cabin. The fire was still burning low inside. It would warm him for another night, but it would not fill the silence. That, he knew, was something only he could fill. Weeks passed, and Elias settled into an uneasy rhythm. The silence had become a part of him, yet it weighed on him more heavily than he had ever imagined. He began to question whether he had made the right choice in retreating so far into the wilderness. In the stillness of the mountains, time seemed to stretch infinitely, each day blending into the next. But as the days grew longer and the frost began to loosen its grip on the land, a subtle shift took place, one that Elias could feel in his bones but could not yet name. One morning, after a fitful night of restless sleep, Elias woke to a strange noise outside. It wasn't the usual howl of the wind or the creak of snow falling from the trees. This was something different. It was a sound he hadn't heard in weeks, the crunching of snow beneath heavy paws. His breath caught in his throat. He knew exactly what it was: a bear. The grizzly had been circling the area for days, always, just beyond his sight, but never close enough to give chase. Elias had learned to listen to the wilderness, to hear the subtle signs of danger, the unnatural silence before a storm, the way animals moved when they sensed something was wrong. He had always prided himself on his instincts, but this time his senses felt sharper, more urgent. The bear's tracks were unmistakable. Deep, wide prints in the snow marked its path, leading toward the cabin. Elias grabbed his rifle, his heart pounding. He moved quickly, silently, but there was no hiding from the inevitable. The bear was too close. He crouched near the door, listening intently, his rifle steady in his hands. The bear's breath was ragged in the cold air, its paws scraping against the stone walls of the cabin. Elias could hear the low growl of frustration as it tested the structure, pushing against the door, trying to find a way in. The cabin had withstood every storm, every trial, but could it hold against a bear that was desperate, that smelled its prey? For a moment, Elias wondered if this was it, the end. His cabin, for all its strength, was still just a small shelter in the vast wilderness. The bear had the size, the power, and the tenacity to break through if it truly wanted to. Elias's pulse raced. He knew that he had to act quickly. His options were limited. He had one shot, maybe two, before the bear broke through. His mind raced as he calculated his move. Should he fire now, or wait for the bear to give him an opening? The minutes stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. The cabin creaked under the pressure, and Elias's grip tightened on his rifle. He couldn't afford to hesitate. The bear wasn't leaving. Then, just as Elias braced himself to make his move, the growling stopped. The sound of heavy paws receded, and for a moment everything was still again. The bear had moved away. Elias let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His heart was still racing, and his body ached with tension, but for now he had survived. The bear had left, but he knew it would return. It always did. The wilderness was full of dangers that could not be avoided, only faced head-on. As Elias sat by the fire that evening, trying to calm his nerves, he realized that the bear wasn't the only threat he faced. The wilderness itself was an enemy, one that tested him at every turn, silently, patiently, waiting for the moment when he would falter. And out here, in the cold, the mountain demanded respect, for it could take everything without a second thought. The following weeks were a blur of activity. The bear's visits became more frequent, each one more persistent than the last. Elias had grown accustomed to the creature's presence, but that didn't mean he was any less wary. He had learned to track the bear's movements, to anticipate where it would go next, and how long it would linger before moving on. The danger had become a constant companion, lurking just outside the cabin's walls. But it wasn't the bear that weighed most heavily on Elias's mind. It was the mountain itself, the relentless solitude, the silence that pressed in on him day after day. He had come to the wilderness to find something: peace, clarity, freedom. But the longer he stayed, the more it felt like a burden. The isolation, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now seemed like a prison. The weight of it pressed down on him, a constant reminder that he was alone, that no one could share this with him. Elias had built the cabin for survival, but he hadn't anticipated how much the wilderness would demand of him. The strength it required, the emotional toll it took, was something he hadn't considered when he first set foot in the mountains. And now, with each passing day, the burden of that strength felt heavier. It wasn't just about surviving the elements or fending off predators. It was about keeping his mind intact, finding meaning in the silence, and fighting off the creeping sense of despair that threatened to take hold. He spent more time in the cabin, repairing small cracks that had begun to form in the stone, checking the hearth to ensure the fire was always steady. Every task, no matter how small, felt like a way to stave off the isolation. He found himself obsessing over the details: how tightly the logs were fitted, how securely the door was reinforced. The work became an outlet for his anxiety, a way to focus on something tangible, something he could control. One evening, as he was preparing to rest, Elias heard a noise. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to rouse his attention. He grabbed his rifle instinctively and moved to the door, peering into the darkness. His heart pounded in his chest as he listened, his mind racing. The wind had picked up again, and the snow was falling thickly, blanketing the ground. The air was cold and sharp, but there was something else, something out of place. Elias's pulse quickened. He could hear movement just beyond the reach of the cabin's light. A shadow moved in the distance, large and ominous. It wasn't a bear this time. The shape was too small, too quick. Elias's heart skipped a beat as the figure drew closer. He couldn't make out its features, but he could feel the presence of something just beyond the safety of his cabin, something that belonged to the wilderness. And yet, it was closer than he had ever imagined. The silence felt oppressive, suffocating. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. In that moment, Elias realized that the true challenge of the wilderness wasn't just survival. It was the constant, unyielding awareness that danger was always just beyond the horizon, The wilderness would never let him forget that. It demanded everything, his strength, his resolve, his sanity. And the more Elias fought to survive, the more he understood that survival itself was not just about enduring the mountain. It was about enduring everything that came with it, the solitude, the uncertainty, and the weight of strength that was needed to keep going. As the shadow neared, Elias raised his rifle. The test was not just whether he could survive the wilderness, it was whether he could face its deepest fears without turning back. As the days continued to bleed into one another, Elias found himself trapped between two opposing forces: the wilderness outside his cabin, which had become his constant companion, and the pull of his own thoughts, which seemed to grow louder with each passing moment. The isolation had gnawed at him, turning from a comfort into a burden, and now, as winter wore on, the snow outside began to feel like a barrier, separating him from the world he had left behind. He had come to the mountains seeking a kind of peace, a solitude where he could find clarity. But what he had found was a silence that echoed with 1,000 unanswered questions. Was this truly what he wanted? Was he running from something, or was he truly seeking something? He had built the cabin, fortified it against the wild forces that threatened to tear it apart, but now he wondered if he had been building a fortress against something deeper, the doubts and fears that he had left behind, only to have them follow him here, to this place of stone and snow. Every night he sat by the fire, staring into the flames, watching the logs burn down to embers. The warmth from the fire was a comfort, but it was a fleeting one. As soon as the fire died down, the cold would creep back in, and he would be left with nothing but his thoughts. And yet, in those moments, when the light of the fire flickered and the shadows grew long, Elias realized something. The wilderness had never been the enemy. It had been the mirror he needed to see himself more clearly. He was here because he had been searching for something, a way to escape, a way to find peace. But the wilderness wasn't just a place to escape to. It was a place where truth had to be faced, where survival required more than just physical endurance. It required the courage to face the parts of yourself you had been running from. The silence wasn't something to be feared. It was a chance to listen, to understand. One night, after the wind had finally died down and the air had cleared, Elias stepped outside the cabin. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a cold, pale light over the snow. The world was still, a vast expanse of white, stretching as far as the eye could see. Elias looked out into the wilderness, taking in the stark beauty of the night. The mountains were silent, and for a moment, so was he. In that silence, Elias made a decision. He had been running from the world, from himself, and from the doubts that had followed him here. But the wilderness had taught him something important. Survival wasn't just about escaping the dangers of nature. It was about confronting your own fears, your own vulnerabilities. And in that moment, Elias understood that he had been avoiding the very thing he needed to face, the truth of why he had come here in the first place. The decision wasn't easy, and it wasn't immediate, but Elias knew that it was time. The wilderness had given him what he needed. Now he would have to go back to the world he had left behind, carrying the lessons of the mountains with him. Elias spent the next few days preparing for what he knew was coming. The decision he had made wasn't one that could be reversed. He had chosen to face the world again, to leave behind the solitude of the mountains and re-enter the life he had walked away from. But before he could go, there were still things to do. The cabin needed to be secured, his supplies packed, and the land cleared. He couldn't leave in haste. He had to be methodical, just as he had been when building his shelter. It wasn't just about the physical preparation. Elias had spent years carving a life out of the wilderness, learning to live with the land, to respect its forces. But now he had to leave it behind, and in doing so he had to reconcile the man he had become with the man he used to be. The quiet, solitary life he had carved for himself had become an identity, and now he had to shed it. The process of breaking down his life in the wilderness felt like taking apart his very self. Each piece, whether it was a tool, a trap, or a log in the cabin, represented a part of who he had become. As Elias packed his things, he began to realize how deeply connected he had become to this place. Every decision, every action had been a part of his transformation. And now, as he prepared to leave, there was a sense of loss that he hadn't expected. The wind howled through the trees, and Elias felt the cold sting of it on his face as he stood outside, packing the last of his supplies. The pack on his back felt heavier than it ever had before. He had thought that the weight of the wilderness would be the hardest thing to carry, but now he understood that the weight of leaving it behind was just as heavy. It wasn't just about the land he was leaving, though. It was about the man he had become out here. The wilderness had changed him, but now he had to change again. There was no going back to the life he had left behind. The man who had once sought solace in the mountains was no longer the same. He was someone else now, someone who had learned the value of both solitude and connection, someone who had faced his fears and emerged with a new understanding of what survival meant. With the final piece of his gear strapped to his back, Elias stood in front of the cabin one last time. The structure was solid, just as he had built it, but it felt different now. The cabin had been a symbol of his escape, his refuge. But now, it was just a reminder of the past, a past that he had to leave behind to move forward. Elias took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill his lungs, and then he turned his back on the cabin. The mountains loomed ahead, vast and silent. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that it was time to face it. He had made the first step. Now the rest of the journey was up to him. As he walked away from the cabin and into the unknown, Elias felt something inside him shift. The wilderness had shaped him, but now it was time to let go. There would be new challenges ahead, but with each step, Elias knew that he was no longer running from anything. He was walking toward something, a new chapter in his life, one that he had chosen, one that he would face with the strength he had gained from the mountains. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was his to walk. The sun had barely risen over the jagged peaks when Elias set out, his pack heavy with provisions. The weight of the world seemed to settle on his shoulders as he looked back at the cabin one last time. The sturdy stone walls, the reinforced door, and the warmth of the hearth were all behind him now. The mountain, with its quiet, unyielding beauty, had given him what he needed: time, perspective, and a chance to confront his own inner turmoil. But now it was time to leave it all behind. Elias had spent the better part of the past few months wrestling with the decision to leave. The mountain had been his refuge, a sanctuary from the noise and chaos of the world. But the very stillness that had once been a comfort had become suffocating. He knew that he couldn't stay here forever. The wilderness, while beautiful, was also a place of loneliness, a place that demanded more than he had to give. Now, as he walked away from the cabin, he felt a mix of emotions: relief, fear, hope. The trail before him was familiar yet foreign. It wound down through the narrow valley and up toward the ridge that would take him to the lowlands. The cold still clung to the air, biting at his skin, but there was something different about it today. It wasn't the harsh, isolating cold of the winter storms he had weathered in the cabin. It was the cold of the open road, the unknown path ahead. With each step, Elias felt his connection to the mountains slip away. He had spent so much time in the wilderness that he had forgotten what it was like to be part of something bigger, part of the world that existed beyond the isolation of the peaks. But now, with every stride, he was moving closer to that world, a world that was full of voices, of people, of the life he had left behind. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. The first few miles passed quickly, his thoughts consumed by the transition. He had been a mountain man for so long, had built his life around survival, that the idea of reintegrating into society felt daunting. What would it be like to return to the hustle and bustle of life, to share a table with strangers, to speak without the long silences of the mountains? As the terrain began to flatten, Elias paused to drink from his canteen. Obvious. Landscape stretched before him, wide open plains, small hills, and the occasional distant figure of a lone tree. It was beautiful in its own way, but it felt so different from the mountains. The air was thinner here, the silence not as profound. He could hear the distant sound of birds and the rustling of dry grass. The world was alive, and it was an overwhelming feeling. He couldn't help but wonder if he had made a mistake. Was he really ready to leave the mountain behind, to face whatever the world had in store for him? Or had he been running from something deeper, something that he hadn't fully understood until now? But as the day wore on and the sun climbed higher in the sky, Elias pushed those doubts aside. The past had shaped him, but it no longer defined him. He was moving forward, and that was all that mattered. The road ahead was uncertain, but with each step Elias felt himself becoming a part of the world again, a world that was full of possibilities. By the time Elias reached the edge of the lowlands, the sun had begun to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the open fields. His body was sore from the long walk, and his feet ached from the miles of rough terrain, but there was a sense of quiet satisfaction in the progress he had made. He had crossed the threshold from the wilderness to the world beyond, and the change was palpable. The air smelled different here, more humid and thick, with the scent of earth. The sounds of birds and insects filled the silence, and the distant hum of life made the wilderness seem even farther behind him. As he walked into a small settlement, the reality of re-entering society hit him with full force. People were bustling about, carrying bundles of firewood, children running through the streets, and the chatter of neighbors exchanging pleasantries. Elias had forgotten how many people lived in close proximity to each other, how the world outside the mountains hummed with constant activity. He moved quietly through the settlement, not wanting to draw attention to himself. He felt like a ghost, a visitor in a world he no longer understood. His rough clothes, worn from months of solitary living, made him stand out. He could see the curious glances from the people around him, the unspoken question in their eyes. Who was this man, with his wild beard and unkempt hair, carrying nothing but a pack and a rifle? Elias tried to avoid their gaze, unsure how to interact. He had spent so long alone, speaking only to himself or to the occasional wild animal, that he had forgotten how to communicate with people. He hadn't realized how much he had distanced himself from the world, how much he had forgotten about the simple art of conversation. After a while he came to a small inn on the edge of the settlement. It looked simple, the kind of place that offered food, warmth, and a bed for travelers. Elias hesitated at the door. A part of him wanted to keep moving, to avoid contact, but another part of him, a part he had forgotten, yearned for the connection that only human contact could provide. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. The warmth of the inn enveloped him, and for a moment he stood still, letting the heat from the fire seep into his bones. The innkeeper, an older man with a thick gray beard, looked up from behind the counter. His eyes studied Elias for a moment before he spoke. "Well, you've certainly come a long way, haven't you?" the man said, his voice low but friendly. Elias nodded, unsure of how to respond. "I'm just passing through," he said, his voice rough from the days of silence. The innkeeper gave a small chuckle. "Well, we don't see many travelers in these parts. What brings you here?" Elias hesitated. He could feel the weight of the question pressing down on him. What did bring him here? The desire to survive? The need for change? He didn't have the answers yet. "I'm just looking for a place to rest," Elias said finally, his voice quieter than he meant it to be. The innkeeper nodded, a knowing smile crossing his face. "Well, you're welcome to stay the night. A hot meal and a bed await you. Rest, and tomorrow maybe you'll find what you're looking for." As Elias sat at the table, the warmth of the inn wrapping around him, he realized that he hadn't fully understood what he was looking for until now. The journey had been long, but it was only just beginning. The world outside the wilderness was vast and full of faces, some familiar, some strange. But now, Elias understood that facing the world meant more than just surviving. It meant opening himself up, connecting with those around him, and taking the first step toward understanding who he was in this new world. Elias woke the next morning to the smell of bread baking in the hearth and the sound of low voices drifting from downstairs. The warmth of the inn had settled into his bones, and for the first time in a long while he felt something akin to comfort. It had been months since he had slept in a proper bed, and the soft sheets felt like a luxury compared to the rough blankets he had grown used to in the mountains. As he dressed and made his way downstairs, he was greeted by the sight of a small but lively dining area. The innkeeper's wife was serving breakfast to a handful of travelers, 2 men in worn work clothes, a woman with a child at her side, and a few others scattered about the room. The inn's small size and rustic charm reminded Elias of simpler times, of places he had passed through on his travels before the mountain had consumed him. But those days felt like a lifetime ago. The innkeeper, who had introduced himself as Gerald, waved Elias over to a table near the fire. "You're welcome to join us for breakfast," he said, his smile warm. "No charge for the first meal. A little hospitality never hurt anyone." Elias hesitated. The idea of sitting with strangers, of breaking bread with people, was both foreign and unsettling. The quiet of the mountains had become a part of him, and the noise of the inn, the chatter, the movement of people, was overwhelming. But as his stomach rumbled, Elias knew he couldn't refuse. He needed the food, and more than that, he needed to try to reconnect. He sat down at the table, his eyes scanning the others. The 2 men, rough-looking and weathered from hard labor, gave him brief nods but said nothing. The woman with the child glanced up at him, but Elias could sense her wariness. There was an awkwardness in the air, the kind of tension that accompanies strangers forced into proximity by necessity. Gerald, sensing the unspoken discomfort, began the conversation. "So, what brings you through these parts, friend? You're not from around here, I can tell." Elias looked up, the question striking him in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't a simple inquiry, it was a challenge, a way to break the ice, to force him to face the reality of his own situation. "I've been traveling," Elias said slowly, "looking for something, a change, I suppose." The woman with the child smiled slightly. "Change can be good," she said, her voice soft but kind. "I've been looking for change myself. Life on the road with a little one isn't easy, but you keep moving, don't you?" Elias nodded, grateful for the conversation, though he didn't have much to add. The others didn't seem inclined to share much either, and there was an unspoken understanding that they were all strangers, bound only by the temporary comfort of this small space. The food arrived, warm bread, eggs, and stew, and Elias ate quietly, savoring the nourishment in a way he hadn't for some time. The conversation stayed light, mostly filled with small talk about the weather, the roads, and the inn's offerings. But as Elias listened, he realized that this, in many ways, was the start of his return. He wasn't just here to rest, to eat, to escape. He was here to reconnect, to begin learning what it meant to be part of something again, even if that something was as simple as a meal shared with strangers. By the time breakfast was finished, Elias felt the weight of the past few months lift slightly. The conversation, though sparse, had reminded him that human connection was still possible, even in the most unexpected places. Elias spent the next few days in the inn, resting and recovering from the long journey. He had become accustomed to the rhythms of the place, the laughter and chatter of the other travelers, the creak of the inn's old wooden floors, and the constant hum of activity. It was different from the isolation of the mountains, but it was a welcome change. The bustle of the world outside was a reminder of everything he had been running from, but also everything he was returning to. Each day he ventured out into the settlement, exploring the shops and markets, getting a feel for life. Beyond the cabin, he learned quickly that the world outside was fast-paced and full of people with needs, desires, and routines that were foreign to him. There were farmers, traders, and craftsmen, each focused on their own work, their own survival. But despite the chaos, there was a sense of community. People looked out for one another, strangers became friends over time, and the bonds of shared life seemed stronger than anything Elias had known in his isolated existence. One afternoon, while walking through the market, Elias encountered a man selling tools and equipment, hammers, axes, and other necessities for life on the frontier. The man was older, his back bent from years of labor, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "You look like a man who's done some hard work," the man said, eyeing Elias's worn pack and rugged appearance. "If you're in need of anything, I've got what you need." Elias nodded, unsure what to say. He had lived without many of the comforts others seemed to take for granted. He had built his own tools, fixed his own problems, but here, in this place, things were different. He realized that there were ways of doing things he hadn't considered, shortcuts, tools that made the hard work of survival a little easier. "Maybe I could use a new axe," Elias said, his voice thoughtful. "Something better than the one I've been using." The man smiled as if he'd been waiting for the request. He led Elias to a selection of finely crafted axes, each one polished and sharp. As Elias inspected the tools, the man spoke again. "You know, it's not just about surviving out there," the man said, his voice low. "It's about building something that lasts. You've got to put in the effort, sure, but you also need the right tools, the right support." Elias nodded, understanding the implication. It wasn't enough just to survive anymore. He needed to start building something else, something with purpose. And for the first time in a long time, the thought didn't feel as daunting as it once had. He was ready to step into this new world, to find his place, and to rebuild what he had left behind. With a new axe in hand and a renewed sense of purpose, Elias made his way back to the inn, ready to face whatever came next. The world, with all its complexities and noise, was no longer something to fear. It was simply another frontier to navigate. And he had already learned what it took to survive on the frontier. Now he would learn what it took to thrive. Elias awoke early the next morning, the first light of dawn filtering through the small window of the inn. His mind had been restless, spinning with the weight of the previous day's conversation with the young woman. Her words had echoed in his mind long into the night. "It just asks that you show up." There was a simplicity in that, a truth that he had long forgotten amidst the isolation of the mountains. The world didn't require him to be someone else to change or explain. It just wanted him to be there, present in the moment. Elias spent the morning walking through the settlement, the warmth of the sun on his face, a stark contrast to the cold, harsh winds he had grown accustomed to in the mountains. He passed by familiar faces, and for the first time he didn't feel like an outsider. People greeted him with nods, smiles, and simple exchanges. It wasn't much, but it was enough. In the small interactions of daily life, Elias felt something he hadn't in years: connection. By the time the afternoon rolled in, he found himself at the edge of the town, looking out over the fields. The land stretched wide before him, and for the first time in a long while he felt a sense of belonging. It wasn't in the walls of the cabin he'd built or the solitude he'd sought. It was here, in the spaces between the people and the work they shared. It wasn't about grand changes or forced connections. It was about showing up day by day and allowing the world to unfold in its own time. Elias smiled, feeling lighter than he had in months. He didn't need to have all the answers, but he just needed to keep moving forward. As the days passed, Elias continued to settle into life in the settlement. The routine had become familiar, helping with repairs, lending a hand at the market, and talking with travelers who passed through. It was a peaceful existence, one that felt worlds away from the rugged, solitary life he had left behind in the mountains. He had slowly started to form connections, small ones, but real enough to make him feel like part of the community. One evening, as he sat on the porch of the inn, the sun setting in the distance, He overheard a conversation between two men who were passing through. They spoke of the mountains, the wildness, the solitude, and the traps they set for game. Elias's heart stirred as he listened, the pull of the land he had left behind whispering in his ear. Despite the warmth and comfort of the settlement, Elias realized that a part of him still longed for the mountains. He had spent so many years there, surviving, building, and facing challenges head-on. There was something about that life, that simplicity, that quiet certainty, which he couldn't ignore. He stood up and walked to the edge of the town, looking toward the distant peaks. The mountains called to him, not with the same urgency they once had, but with a quiet understanding that he wasn't done with them yet. They were part of him, and no matter how far he had come, they would always remain a piece of his heart. Elias didn't know what the future held, but he understood one thing clearly: he could always return, whether to the mountains or to a new path, as long as he kept moving forward. The following week, Elias was working alongside the blacksmith, hammering nails into a wooden post, when a familiar face appeared at the edge of the settlement. It was the young woman from the inn, her eyes bright with purpose. She approached Elias with a kind smile, and he paused, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "Elias," she said, her voice laced with a quiet excitement, "I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to take on a bit of work for me." Elias raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. "What kind of work?" "I've been thinking a lot about what you said before," she began. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, and you know the land. I could use someone like you for a project I'm starting. We're planning a small settlement further north, and I need help with the construction." Elias considered her words carefully. The idea of returning to something like the cabin he had built, but this time as part of something larger, something with more purpose, appealed to him. He'd been drifting for so long, but this felt like something he could invest in, a chance to build something that would last. "I don't know," Elias replied. "It's a big step. I've spent a lot of time alone." The young woman's smile remained steady. "I understand, but think about it. You know how to build, how to survive. And you don't have to do it alone. There's a whole group of people coming together for this." Elias took a deep breath, the weight of the decision settling on him. The mountains were always there, but he felt the pull of this new life, the potential for something greater than solitude. After a long pause, he nodded. "I'll help," he said, his voice steady. "I think it's time." Elias's journey was far from over, but with each day he felt the weight of the past lift more and more. The work on the new settlement had already begun, and Elias found himself at the forefront of it, using the skills he had honed in the wilderness to help shape this new community. It wasn't about escaping anymore. It was about creating something, about contributing to a future that was still unfolding. The first few weeks were difficult. There were days when Elias missed the solitude of the mountains, the quiet of his cabin, and the way the wilderness had been his only companion. But as the settlement began to take shape, as the cabins rose and the people worked side by side, Elias realized that this was the kind of life he had been seeking. A life where he could still connect to the land, still feel the pull of the mountains, but also be part of something larger than himself. One evening, as Elias stood atop a hill overlooking the settlement, he watched the sun dip below the horizon, casting the world in soft, golden light. The mountains were still there, looming in the distance, but they no longer felt like a place to run to. They were a part of his past, and now, this, the settlement, the people, the work, was his present and his future. Elias smiled to himself, a quiet contentment filling him. He had walked through the wilderness, faced his fears, and learned the value of connection. And now, with the dawn of a new chapter, he knew that the road ahead was his to walk, a road filled with endless possibilities. The future was uncertain, but Elias had learned that as long as he kept moving forward, as long as he stayed true to the lessons of the past, he would always find his way.